Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the beginning of the last days. My name is Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson, and so we'll start with you, Alex. Welcome back to the show. We love having you.
Great to be here. It's an honor. Thank you so much, Laura Lynn.
You're welcome. So, in going to this event, a conference, you were there, and you met Michael there. Said hello. You were presenting some things. What were some of the concerns that you were highlighting?
So this was the annual gathering of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's, the bishops from across the United States get together in Baltimore every year, and they talk about issues that are important to the church. So we held a press conference there. It was put on by a coalition of Catholic organizations called the Deposit of Faith Coalition. Now, I am not a Catholic, although I did grow up as a CEO, Christmas and Easter only Catholic, in a Catholic family. And I was honored to be invited to participate in this. And so what I shared really was the insights that I have gleaned over 15 years of covering the UN climate summits. I try to go every year. I was just recently on the Arabian Peninsula for the COP28. The year before that, I was on the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt for the COP27. The first one of these I went to was back fresh out of journalism school in 2009 in Copenhagen. That was the COP15. So I've been going to these for a long time. And, there was an expert scientist there, a Nobel laureate, Dr. John Clauser. So I didn't get a lot into the science, although I did share quite a few clips of interviews I had done with leading scientists, Harvard, MIT, Princeton, Yale, including numerous scientists who have worked for the UN on their UN IPCC report. But what I really focused on was the incompatibility of the climate change narrative with historic Christian doctrine, with the Bible, of course, and even with Catholic doctrine. What they are doing here, to be very clear, is redefining, or at least I should say, attempting to redefine morality. And unfortunately, the Pope has really worked hard on this. At the COP28 that I just went to, and then this conference was before the COP28, but at the COP28, they had a faith pavilion, and they said they placed it strategically right at the heart of the conference. So the Pope himself, Pope Francis, was supposed to come there to inaugurate the Faith Pavilion. Unfortunately, he got sick, and so he had to send the Secretary of State for the Vatican. But right in his opening remarks, he was just reading the Pope's speech, he said that our environmental, I forget what he said, acts or whatever, are an offense against God. And frankly, the idea that the gas that I exhale, carbon dioxide, the gas that humans produce with everything we do, the idea that that's a sin against God is utterly preposterous. It's ridiculous. It has no basis in science or in the Bible. And so that's kind of what I showed, and also the paganism, right? I mean, a lot of these conferences, you see open paganism. The COP16 in Cancun, the head of the UN climate apparatus actually opened it up with a prayer to the Mayan goddess Ixchel. She said this was the goddess of tapestries and creativity, and so we were going to summon her and ask for her guidance in creating a tapestry of creative solutions to climate change. Well, I whipped out my laptop, looked it up. Ixchel is the goddess of cannibalism, war, and human sacrifice. So it gives you a little bit of insight into what's going on here. This is not Christian. This is wicked.
And what really bothers me about what's happening right now is that as we look into this pontificate of Pope Francis, we see more and more alignment with paganism, with the Marxist left. I did a report a few ago showing that Pope Francis had invited a bunch of open communists to the Vatican. He presented a speech to them, and he supported them in what they were doing. And we examined the organizations that were there, one of which was called MST, which is based in Brazil. The woman that represented MST that was being interviewed for this particular Vatican video, her name is Ceres Hadich. We went to her Facebook page, and the first thing that we found was that she was conducting a read aloud of the Communist Manifesto with her husband and two young children as the Communist Internationale was playing in the background. And MST, the organization, has all sorts of laudable things to say about Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto and how important communism is, and they have to march to the beat of communism. That was just one example of what we found. We found so much more, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I love my faith. I love my church, and what's happening right now breaks my heart.
What can you tell me about some of the other things that you are concerned is happening, and why is this happening?
Well, as you're looking at the website here, you see that we just recently put out a report on Catholic Relief Services. We actually partnered with Population Research Institute and Steve Mosier and sent a team of investigators on the ground in 3 African countries to look into Catholic Relief Services and their projects. What we found is that Catholic Relief Services created health referral networks that were referring young girls to contraception providers, one of which was actually an abortion provider called Renata. And you see the logo there. Renata is a pro-abortion organization. They openly advocate for abortion. They've admitted that they take young girls to receive abortions, and their logo is an icon for abortion. It's a pregnant woman with an X through the location of the baby. Last year, we put out a report, a 64-page report, showing that the largest Catholic health network in the United States, called Common Spirit Health, is performing transgender surgeries in California and elsewhere.
Do you think that, like, the Pope has been doing really crazy things and saying stuff that has upset Catholics? Is this coming from the top, or is this infiltration at every level all over the world?
We know that in the 1920s and the 1930s, the communists in Moscow made it their mission to infiltrate seminaries and to put their people into place. By the time the 1960s rolled around, many of the people that were put into seminaries in the 20s and 30s had risen to the rank of bishop and cardinal. We know that for a fact. That has happened. Those individuals, now this isn't to say that the entire Catholic Church is infiltrated, but part of the problem is that many of the bishops currently don't recognize that that's exactly what's taken place, so they don't understand what's happening, and they don't understand why it's happening. My desire is to help open their eyes and to help them see that the reason that they are struggling to get people in the pews and to retain them as faithful Catholics is because their seminaries have been infiltrated, and their brother bishops and cardinals, many of them, are working for the other side.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that Michael just had to share. In fact, a lot of those organizations, as he was talking about, I've got some experience with, including the MST, the Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil. I used to live down there. This is actually a communist terrorist organization. They are involved in actual crimes of immense proportions, attacking farmers, attacking landowners, really, really serious stuff. And of course, the Pope was in Canada not too long ago, prancing around with pagans and doing weird rituals and putting feathers on his head and doing the rituals with the incense and the smoke. But this infiltration that Michael just described of the Catholic seminaries is not unique to Catholicism. In fact, you see it especially clearly in the mainline Protestant denominations in the United States, many of which were functionally taken over decades ago. They are not churches in any legitimate sense of the term anymore. They're social clubs dedicated to the promotion of anti-biblical, anti-Christian values at every level, including government policies that involve wealth redistribution, including government policies that involve abortion, contraception, things like this. And also the normalization of LGBTism and all the rest of it. So these are not churches in any legitimate sense of the word anymore. And one of the things that I have focused on that has been so troubling to me is the attempted unification of all these religions as part of this move toward a one world religious, economic, and political system. And I've had a front row seat to this. Of course, the Vatican is deeply involved in promoting this. And I have no doubt that many of the people involved are subversives and infiltrators within the Catholic hierarchy. But the UN has a whole operation dedicated to bringing the religions and the religious leaders of the world on board with the agenda. Peter Drucker, the so-called management guru, big-time establishment guy, he explained that if you want to make any really profound, significant changes in the world, you've got to use what he described as a three-legged stool approach. So the first leg of the stool is, of course, the government, the public sector. The second leg of the stool is the private sector. That's the commercial interests, businesses, et cetera. The third leg of the stool is religion, is the social sector. And so what we're watching now is each of these sectors, the governments of the world, the businesses of the world, and the religions of the world are uniting behind a global agenda. The global agenda has a name. Actually, in 2015, the governments of the world came together. Pope Francis was there. In fact, Fox News said he was giving the governments their marching orders, and they approved something called the 2030 Agenda, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The head of the UN General Assembly at that time, Peter Thompson, described it as the master plan for humanity. And I imagine God had a good chuckle about that. Then you had the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, called this the Global Declaration of Interdependence, a direct attack on our Declaration of Independence. So you had the governments of the world adopting this. Just a few years later, the World Economic Forum signed a strategic partnership with the United Nations to, in their words, implement Agenda 2030 through the private sector. They bring the big businesses to the table, et cetera. Now let's get to the religious component. So there's an organization funded by the United Nations, funded by the U.S. State Department, very close ties to the Vatican. It's called Religions for Peace. Now, the new head of this, actually, her previous job was running the UN Population Fund. She was a senior official over there. This is the UN agency dedicated to the proposition that there are too many people on the planet, that when God said, be fruitful and multiply, he intended us to stop at some undetermined point in the past, and that we need to reduce the number of people. So I have her on camera saying, we are the UN of religions. All the religions of the world are part of this, she said. And very, very clearly, that's what they're going for. They had a meeting in 2019 where all of these major religious leaders, again, purporting to represent all the religions of the world, came together and signed a document committing their followers, their faithful, their disciples, whatever, to human development as set forth in Agenda 2030. So here you've got the religious, the business, and the government sectors all working in unison to advance this one world plot. Very, very nefarious. And there's one more element to this that I think is really worth bringing to the table. I was at the UN conference on the Sinai Peninsula. Again, this was the end of 2022. And with a lot of help from the Vatican and the Catholic hierarchy. And of course, there were evangelical denominations there. The Orthodox were there, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, every kind of pagan you can imagine. They flew in some guy from the Amazon rainforest with a nice feathered headdress. They marched up to the top of what they say is Mount Sinai. You know, there's some debate about whether that's really Mount Sinai, but they marched up to the top of what they say is Mount Sinai. And first they did a climate repentance ceremony where they repented of their alleged environmental crimes, their carbon emissions, their flights, their stakes, whatever. All I could think of was like, you know, this is probably what the prophets of Baal looked like on top of Mount Carmel. I mean, total idiocy. And then the most blasphemous part of this, they whipped out a new 10 commandments. They called it the new 10 commandments. And they did this weird ceremony. The guy's ranting and raving about how governments have to do more to solve climate change. And then he smashes the tablets like Moses did when he came down and found them worshiping the calf, the golden calf. My guess is he probably didn't understand the biblical narrative very well, didn't see the incredible irony in this absurdity. And I later caught some of these guys at the UN conference, the organizers of this, and asked them for an interview. And they were gracious enough to grant me an interview, which I thought was rather funny. So I got them for 45 minutes on camera, exclusive interview. And I asked them, you know, what are you doing? They said, well, we're working on these new 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments are utterly ridiculous. I mean, compassion means feeling the cries of Mother Earth. I mean, it's utterly blasphemous absurdities. And then one of the guys, the CEO of the Peace Department, tells me that not only do we have the new 10 commandments, we're also now working, he said, the UN and friends, on the third covenant, right? So God gave us the old covenant. God gave us the new covenant. These guys are going to give us the third covenant, which they said we're going to use to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So this is what's happening, folks. And you're not hearing this from the fake media. I actually put it on the cover of the New American Magazine. It was so significant. But all the religions of the world are coming together behind this blasphemous pagan climate change narrative. And the Vatican, unfortunately, is right at the center of it.
Wow, absolutely shocking. Michael, if you could weigh in on this whole issue to do with climate, do you see this as well as an issue?
You bet. We did an article back in 2019, and the title of it is Pope Francis Promotes Goals Created by Communists. And what we did is we started tracking Pope Francis's promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is Agenda 2030, going all the way back to the very beginning of his pontificate. You have to remember, he was elected as Pope in March of 2013. We found a UN document that actually cites a discussion that was had between Ban Ki-moon and Jeffrey Sachs and Pope Francis. Incidentally, I'm told that Jeffrey Sachs all but has a permanent office in the Vatican now. But in this document, it says, quote, appreciation of these issues is growing within the UN as evidenced, for example, in the May 2014 meeting between the UN leadership and representatives of the Vatican and His Holiness the Pope on the SDG agenda. This meeting was followed by an audience between the UN Secretary General and His Holiness, who committed the Catholic Church to support the SDG efforts. And then the very next year, Pope Francis comes out with Laudato Si, which makes 23 direct references to sustainable development. In 2015, when Pope Francis addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, he appealed for universal adoption of the SDGs. He said, the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the World Summit, which opens today, is an important sign of hope. I am similarly confident that the Paris Conference on Climate Change will secure fundamental and effective agreements. In 2016, Pope Francis addressed the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, and he said, I am grateful for the fact that the representatives of the 193 UN member states unanimously approved the new Sustainable Development Goals. And he did something very similar the next year, where he said in his opening remarks, and he was quoting from Laudato Si, so he was quoting himself. He said the 2030 agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, approved by more than 190 nations in September 2015, were a great step forward for global dialogue, marking a virtually new and universal solidarity. But what we have to remember is that the Sustainable Development Goals, when you go through the 17 different goals themselves, they mirror the goals and the planks of communism line by line. It absolutely totally matches up with communism, not to mention the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals themselves call for universal access to birth control and abortion. And Pope Francis, as the head of the Catholic Church, would know that. But he didn't have a qualifying statement when he called for full adoption of the SDGs. He just said, no, this is a wonderful thing. We have to adopt it.
Yeah. Let me chime in there too.
Yeah.
You were absolutely right, Michael. And in fact, I think the first major article on this in the American media, right when it was adopted. For years, it was actually the top result on Google. Whenever you typed in Agenda 2030, UN Agenda 2030, Google now has suppressed it. They've formed a partnership with the UN to delete and hide anything they don't like, which is nefarious in and of itself. But this was actually and literally created by communists. In fact, right when it was approved by the governments of the world, the CCP, the most murderous organization that has ever existed in human history, slaughtered about 100 million people so far, not including the unborn, murdered in forced abortions, proudly proclaimed through every propaganda organ they had, all their fake newspapers, all their propaganda TV channels, they said, we played a crucial role, was their word, their term, in developing Agenda 2030. And as you read it, it should be very obvious, right? Goal number 10, to give you an example. National socialism apparently is no longer enough. They say very clearly, we have to reduce inequalities within and among countries. In other words, we're going to redistribute the wealth of what's left of the middle class in the United States, in Canada, in Japan, et cetera, to the kleptocrats, the dictatorships of the third world that have impoverished or kept their people in poverty. They say this is only possible if income inequality is addressed, right? They're literally talking about wealth redistribution, socialism, communism on an international scale under the leadership of the United Nations. You go to goal number 4, deals with education. Of course, Karl Marx was a major advocate of the government running the education of all peoples, all children. And if you read goal number 4, very clear that that's what the agenda is. They say that all learners must be, and they don't use this term, but they must be so brainwashed that they will not just passively submit to this agenda from hell, but actually the term they use is they will promote sustainable development. They will promote gender equality, which in UN speak means radical feminism, dismantle the patriarchy, take down the nuclear family, etc. They will promote human rights, which in UN speak is quite literally the opposite of what we mean by rights in the United States, right? Where God gave us rights and government exists to protect those rights. If you read the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's a declaration of privileges. And then in Article 29, they make quite clear that none of these, this is a direct quote, none of these rights and freedoms may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. So that's why when Agenda 2030 was adopted, you had mass murdering, genocidal Marxist dictators like Robert Mugabe celebrating from the floor of the UN General Assembly, saying this was going to usher in a brave new world of equality and sustainability. These communist goals are from the pit of hell. The fact that we have all the governments, all the major religious movements, and all the big businesses of the world marching in lockstep ought to scare everyone who has any common sense.
Wow. And so I'm sure, Michael, that that's something that you're also feeling is that as this moves forward, you have to keep doing this work to expose and expose. You're both on the same page here, and I think the world's a better place because of what you're all talking about. So do you see this this UN, I mean, what what are we to do when the Pope actually does this? And do you think that Catholics are being deceived because of his support?
I do. I absolutely believe that Catholics are being deceived by his actions. I believe that his support for the United Nations is at best misguided. And that's just putting the most charitable spin on it. But the fact of the matter is that the United Nations exists for the purpose of creating a one world global governing system. They don't want to have a one world government, so to speak, but they're trying to create a governing system. And if you study what all of the different Catholic charitable organizations are doing, and I would dare say this actually applies to all of the secular and other religious charitable organizations as well, they are trying to use the act of charity as a means of bypassing governing bodies to implement a new system. They want the Sustainable Development Goals because it allows them to say, well, this is the new way we're going to start to redistribute food, to redistribute wealth, and it won't be by a legislative act. It will be by a supply chain act. So when we need food and we have to go into a particular territory that's been harmed by some sort of natural disaster, we can go to the government and say, because you implemented this project and we are the purveyors of this project, you now have an obligation to supply us with a certain amount of materials and goods, which means you're going to have to take them out of the surplus of what the populace has. They're going to have to steal food and steal resources to redistribute them to other places of the world. And that's why you have Catholic Relief Services, Caritas Internationalis, Adventist Relief Services, World Vision. All these international aid and development agencies are on board with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes, 100%. We've seen this. And Alex, what are your thoughts? I know that you follow all of this and you're seeing all of it and you report on it. And this is a very difficult thing. And also just to give consolation to our Catholic brother, but we're seeing this fall and this compromise in the Christian, evangelical denominations and others like that.
We really are. It's becoming ubiquitous. It's now very pervasive as well in the Orthodox traditions of the East, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox churches. Some of those situations are really bad. I mean, you look at the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, literally run by former KGB officers. So we have a crisis in Christendom. We have a crisis across the Western world where the one institution that is divinely ordained for the propagation of the gospel, the propagation of the truth, is in chaos. It is departing from the historical traditions, from the biblical text, and really teaching, to just be really blunt about it, doctrines of demons, right? The idea that your carbon footprint is sinful and that you need to repent of your carbon footprint sins by giving Al Gore money is not just idiocy. It's not just blasphemy. It's not just a financial scam. You have people who actually believe this stuff, who believe that morality requires them to repent of their carbon emissions. That's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. Theologically, it's utterly preposterous, but it's very dangerous. We're talking here about eternity. We're talking about the destination of your soul. And so these are no joking matters. We've got the church across the board is in a mega crisis. I don't know how else to explain it.
Basically, I think that there was an article written by Epoch Times. The spate of nationwide rallies warn Canadians about the WHO pandemic treaty. And this, of course, is coming. I believe it's in May. This pandemic treaty that wants all of us, every nation, to give up sovereignty and to say basically at the next time that we've got some sort of medical crisis, that we would like to all work in unison.